In the fall of 1881, two brothers named Tom and Jesse Bingham were riding through the southern Black Hills of the Dakota Territory when they heard something that should not have been there, a whistling, steady, mechanical, coming out of open ground on a still day with no wind moving the grass around them. They followed the sound to a hole in the limestone roughly 10 inches by 14, barely wide enough to fit a hand. Tom leaned down over it. The air coming up out of the earth was moving hard enough to take the hat off his head. When Jesse rode back a few days later with friends to show them what they'd found, he leaned over the same hole and the wind had reversed. It was pulling now, not pushing, and it took his hat down into the dark. The ground was inhaling. The Lakota had known about that hole for generations before either brother was born. They called it Oneir Ashoka, the place where the earth breathes inside, and it sat at the center of an emergent story passed down long before any surveyor's stake went into this ground. In that account, the first people did not arrive on the prairie. They came up through the passages beneath it, out through this exact opening, led into a new world where bison waited to provide everything a life would need. Apache and Arapaho travelers knew the site too. No mining claim, no federal designation, no name on a government map made this ground sacred. It already was, and had been, for longer than anyone standing over that hole in 1881 could account for. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the Binghams had stumbled onto is a barometer disguised as a hole in the ground. Wind Cave, as it would come to be called, is enormous below the surface and almost sealed above it, with only a handful of natural openings connecting a vast internal volume to the outside air. When a storm drops the atmospheric pressure outside, the higher pressure air trapped in all that stone rushes to equalize, and it comes out through whatever gap it can find, sometimes at wind speeds measured over 30 miles an hour, spiking past 70 during the sharpest pressure swings this part of South Dakota is known for. When the pressure outside climbs instead, the cave pulls air back in. It was never magic. It was physics working on a scale nobody standing at that hole in 1881 had any way to picture, because nobody yet knew how much cave was on the other side of it. The land didn't stay quiet for long. By 1889, the South Dakota Mining Company had staked a claim over the site, hoping for gold or silver in the limestone. There wasn't any. What the company found instead was a teenager, Jesse D. McDonald, hired to manage the claim, brought his sons Elmer and Alvin out to the property, and it was Alvin, 16 years old, who fell into the cave the way some people fall into a language or an instrument. He explored with a candle in one hand and a ball of twine unspooling behind him to find his way back out, crawling through openings that a grown man would have had to turn sideways to enter. Over the next 4 years, he mapped roughly 8 to 10 miles of passage by that candlelight alone, working alone or with a handful of companions, cataloguing rooms and turns and drops, with a thoroughness that would outlast him by decades. He died of typhoid fever on December 15, 1893. He was 20 years old. His survey of the cave was so complete that no major new passage was found again until 1963, 70 years after he stopped looking. What Alvin left behind was not just a rough sketch. It was a working method, refined trip after trip in near total darkness, tying off twine at every junction so a wrong turn cost him minutes instead of his life, and a diary kept in the same disciplined hand he used to survey the passages themselves. He guided the earliest paying visitors through the cave alongside John Stabler, both of them working from memory and candlelight through rooms that had no names yet, until the two men gave them some, describing formations to strangers who had usually never been more than a few feet underground in their lives. Early photographs from those first tours, preserved in the park's own historical archive, show visitors posed stiffly in one of the front chambers, with a guide holding a lantern, the entire scene lit by nothing but open flame. There was no wiring, no fixed trail, no safety line beyond whatever twine happened to still be there from Alvin's original survey. People went into the ground the same way he had, one candle at a time, trusting a teenager's memory of a maze he had never fully finished walking. The mining claim never paid off, and by 1892, McDonald had shifted from prospecting to something more durable. He partnered with a man named John Stabler, who moved his family to nearby hot springs and built a hotel to receive visitors, and together they formed the wonderful Wind Cave Improvement Company to run tours through the passages Alvin had spent his short life mapping. Ownership of the cave itself became contested almost immediately. Claims and counterclaims tangled between the mining company, the McDonalds, and Stabler, the kind of dispute that tends to end quietly in a filing cabinet. This one didn't. It ended in Washington. On January 9, 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the land into existence as Wind Cave National Park, the 7th national park in the country, and the first national park anywhere in the world created specifically to protect a cave rather than what sat above it. What Roosevelt protected was carved into a layer of rock called the Pahasapa limestone, laid down somewhere between 320 and 350 million years ago at the bottom of a shallow inland sea that once covered this part of the continent. For most of the 20th century, geologists assumed Wind Cave had formed the way most caves do, through rainwater and snowmelt sinking down from the surface, slowly dissolving a path through the limestone on its way to the water table. It's a clean model, and it explains a great many caves around the world correctly. It does not explain this one. Later research, much of it built on decades of fieldwork by cave scientists including Arthur Palmer and his collaborators, established that Wind Cave formed largely through water moving the other direction, mineral-rich and slightly acidic groundwater rising up from below under pressure, dissolving the limestone from underneath rather than from above. Geologists call this hypogenic speleogenesis, and its confirmation here overturned an assumption that had gone essentially unchallenged for most of the park's existence. More recent dating work, using uranium lead ratios measured in the cave's own calcite deposits, places the most active period of that formation in the early to middle Oligocene, tens of millions of years ago, with the cave's shape essentially locked in place long before any river or raindrop on the surface had anything to do with it. That correction did not happen quickly or quietly within the field. It took decades of fieldwork, competing papers, and revised models before the hypogenic explanation displaced the older, more intuitive assumption that had been taught as settled fact for most of the 20th century. The same limestone that hid that argument also preserves a much older one. Embedded in the cave's walls are the fossilized remains of the shallow sea that deposited the Pahasapa limestone in the first place, brachiopod shells pressed into the rock, roughly 300 million years before anyone would use the word Oligocene to describe anything. The cave's ceilings and passage walls are, in a very literal sense, the floor of an ocean that stopped existing long before the Black Hills themselves rose up out of the surrounding plains. Geologists studying the park today are reading two timelines out of the same stone at once, one written in seashells from a vanished coastline, and one written in the calcite left behind when groundwater under pressure carved the empty space those shells now hang inside of. That upside-down origin is also why Wind Cave looks the way it does. Most caves are decorated by dripping water, the slow architecture of stalactites and stalagmites built drop by drop over centuries. Wind Cave has very little of that, because it never depended on dripping water to form. What it has instead, in a concentration found almost nowhere else on the planet, is boxwork. Thin blades of calcite, some no more than a few inches deep, crisscrossing the ceilings and walls of the cave in an interlocking honeycomb lattice that looks deliberate enough to make first-time visitors ask who built it. Nobody built it. Long before the cave existed as open space, cracks in the limestone filled with mineral-rich water and hardened into calcite veins. When the surrounding limestone later dissolved away during the cave's formation, those harder calcite veins were left standing, exposed, forming the fins that make up boxwork today. An estimated 90 to 95% of all the boxwork known to exist anywhere in the world is inside this one cave system. It is not still forming. Whatever calcite is on the walls right now is what there will ever be, a fossil of a process that finished before the cave itself opened up around it, and geologists are still refining exactly how the fracture networks that produced it were oriented and timed. Rangers who lead tours through the developed sections of the cave still watch first-time visitors reach out toward it before catching themselves, because the lattice looks too regular, too intentional, to have grown out of a crack in a rock by accident. It has not been touched or restored since the National Park Service began managing the site. Every fin of calcite visible on a tour today is exactly as fragile and exactly as old as it was when Alvin McDonald first carried a candle past it in the 1880s, and there is no known process by which it could ever be replaced if it were damaged. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The wind itself turned out to be the most useful instrument anyone had for measuring what remained unknown. Because the cave breathes through such a small number of narrow openings relative to its total volume, the strength and pattern of that airflow gives researchers a rough way to estimate how much passage exists beyond what has actually been walked and surveyed. The math is not comforting if your instinct is to think of a national park as a mapped, finished thing. As of the most recent published survey figures, Wind Cave has over 167 miles of documented passage, making it the sixth longest cave system on Earth, contained beneath a park that covers well under 34,000 acres of surface prairie. And by the same barometric calculations that first told scientists this cave was far larger than its entrance implied, something in the range of only 5% of the total system is believed to have been explored at all. The other 95% is inferred from air pressure and airflow, not from anyone's boots. Above all of it, the surface gives nothing away. The park protects close to 34,000 acres of mixed grass prairie and ponderosa pine, and visitors driving through it see bison, pronghorn, and prairie dog towns spread across rolling grassland, with no visible hint that any of it sits on top of a hollow world. A ranger standing at an overlook and a survey team standing in a passage 1,000 feet below could, on the same afternoon, be reading the same storm off two completely different instruments, one watching clouds roll in over the Black Hills, the other watching a barometric logger spike as the cave starts to exhale. It is not the only cave breathing under this stretch of the Black Hills. About 20 miles away, cut into the same Pahasapa and Madison limestone, sits Jewel Cave, a separate system that geologists have confirmed lies on the opposite side of an underground watershed from Wind Cave, distinct despite the shared rock and the shared method of formation. Before 1959, fewer than 2 miles of it had ever been mapped, and the National Park Service was reportedly unsure the site justified its monument status at all. That changed when a geologist named Dwight Deal invited a married couple, Herb and Jan Conn, on what was supposed to be a single caving trip. The Conns were rock climbers, not scientists, living off-grid in a stone cabin they'd built themselves outside Custer, and the trip that was meant to happen once turned into 22 years and more than 700 separate expeditions underground. They squeezed through gaps as narrow as 8 inches, using the same technical skill they'd developed on the granite spires above ground, mapping more than 60 miles of new passage by hand, room by room, using the phrase cavers still use today when a crack in the rock keeps going into darkness. It goes. Herb Conn was not a professional caver by training. He had worked as an electrical engineer for the United States Navy during the Second World War, and he brought that same instinct for measurement and system building underground with him, surveying passage by compass and tape the way he'd once surveyed circuits. Jan Conn, his wife, was equally at home on exposed rock, and had been the first woman to climb Devil's Tower in neighboring Wyoming without the aid of the fixed ladder that most climbers of the era still relied on. The two of them lived in a small stone home outside Custer they called Conn Cave, without electricity or running water, funding their expeditions by working odd jobs above ground. Herb spending summers on ropes repairing cracks in the presidential faces at nearby Mount Rushmore. Below ground, they named what they found as they went, passages called Torture Chamber and Hell's Half Acre among them, descriptions that were rarely exaggeration. Compact and strong from decades of climbing, both Conns could work through gaps as narrow as 8 inches for long stretches at a time, and it was on one of those early trips, in 1961, that they found the corridor of towering rooms and glittering crystal that would become Jewel Cave's scenic tour route. Herb went on to design the lighting system installed along that route himself, work still in use decades later, and in 1966 he published research on the same barometric breathing that had guided the Binghams to Wind Cave 80 years earlier, using Jewel Cave's own airflow to argue that the system was far from finished, that the wind moving through its openings was proof of volume nobody had reached yet. He was right. Volunteer survey teams, working under the National Speleological Society, with the same slow, methodical technique the Conns pioneered, have kept adding to the map every year since, long after Herb's death in 2012 and Jan's own passing years later. Jewel Cave passed 200 surveyed miles in December of 2018, when a 6-person volunteer team spent 3 days underground surveying more than 3,000 feet of new passage to reach the milestone, coming out to a celebration organized by park staff and family who had been waiting on the surface the entire time. The cave now sits well past 215 mapped miles, among the 5 longest cave systems documented anywhere on Earth. A major breakthrough in an area called the Splinter Section, discovered in 2014, added more than 24 miles on its own and left hundreds of documented leads still unexplored, passages that cavers can see extending into darkness, but have not yet had the time, air, or rope to follow. Reaching the current edge of exploration from the visitor entrance takes experienced teams the better part of a day each way, with overnight camps set up underground at a site cavers call Deep Camp, 4 hours past the farthest developed tour route, and 4 hours short of wherever the known cave currently ends. Nobody working that survey believes they are close to finished. The same barometric logic that applies to Wind Cave applies here. The wind coming through Jewel Cave's openings is still, after more than 6 decades of mapping, telling researchers there is more cave on the other side of it than anyone has walked. Wind Cave's own survey work has never really stopped either, even after the long quiet stretch that followed Alvin McDonald's death. Since the major new passages found in 1963 reopened the question of how much cave remained, park staff and volunteer teams affiliated with the same national caving organizations that trained the Conns have continued pushing the surveyed total past 167 miles, packed into a footprint so tight on the surface that cavers and researchers routinely describe Wind Cave as the densest cave system known anywhere in the world, meaning it has more surveyed passage crammed into a smaller area of land than any other cave on record. That density is itself part of the puzzle. A cave that convoluted, folding back on itself in 3 dimensions, across such a small surface footprint, is difficult to model with any confidence, and every new mile surveyed tends to reveal junctions and side passages that the existing map did not anticipate. Teams now carry laser rangefinders and portable scanners into passages that Alvin McDonald once measured by counting his own steps in the dark, and the resulting 3-dimensional models are compared year over year against the same airflow data that first told 19th century observers something enormous was breathing beneath their boots. What sits underneath this small stretch of South Dakota prairie, in other words, is not a finished discovery from 1881 or a settled chapter of National Park Service history. It is an active, ongoing one, measured today the same way it was measured then, by air moving through a hole too small to explain what is on the other side of it. The instruments have improved. Airflow sensors, barometric loggers, laser rangefinders, LiDAR scans that can render a surveyed passage in 3 dimensions before a caver has even reached the surface with their notes. What has not changed is the basic shape of the mystery. A cave breathing harder than its known volume should allow means there is more cave. Nobody has found a hard boundary to either system. Every survey season, teams go back in, and most seasons, the map grows. Visitors today can still walk a fraction of what Alvin McDonald mapped by candle, though nobody carries a candle for light anymore except on one specific summer tour built to recreate exactly that experience. Each guest handed a small bucket lantern and led through the same low passages the earliest guides once walked with nothing else. The developed routes carry the names those first visitors gave them more than a century ago: the Garden of Eden, the Fairgrounds, the Elks Room, the Blue Grotto, a room called Fallen Flats, and another called Temple. Ordinary American names hung on a landscape that had already been sacred under a different name for thousands of years before any of them existed. The cave holds a constant 54 degrees year-round, no matter the season above. Cold enough that every tour group is told to bring a jacket even in August. A reminder that whatever is moving through the passages down there operates on its own separate climate, indifferent to the prairie heat baking the grass a few hundred feet overhead. The hole the Bingham brothers found in 1881 is still there, inside the park boundary near the visitor center, protected now behind a small structure built to keep it from being disturbed, while still letting the wind move freely in and out the way it always has. It still breathes with the weather, the same way it did the day Tom lost his hat to it, and the same way it did days later when Jesse's hat vanished into the dark in the other direction. A sign stands near it now explaining the Lakota beliefs tied to the ground beneath a visitor's feet, translating in a few sentences a story that took generations to tell properly, about people walking up out of that same darkness into a world that was waiting for them, fully formed, on the other side of a threshold too narrow to show what lay beyond it. Alvin McDonald spent 4 years of a 20-year life trying to answer that question with a candle and a piece of string, and mapped more of the answer than anyone else would for the next 7 decades. Herb and Jan Conn spent 22 years answering the same question at Jewel Cave with climbing rope and a compass, in a stone house with no electricity, for no pay beyond the sound of a passage still going. Volunteer teams are down there again this season, in both caves, adding feet and sometimes miles to maps that were supposed to have been finished decades ago, using rope and light and patience in roughly the same proportions their predecessors did, a century and a half after a hat first came off in a hole in the ground. The wind at the entrance today is the same evidence Tom Bingham had when his hat came off his head. It is simply better measured now, and it is still saying the same thing it has said since before there was a park, before there was a company, before there were brothers on horseback following a whistling sound across quiet ground. There is more down there. The air moving through that 10 by 14-inch opening in the rock is proof of a volume nobody has finished counting, and by the numbers researchers currently trust, most of it has never been seen by anyone at all. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.